from AI to drones, governing technology in the age of geopolitical competition. This event today is a cooperation between Carnegie Europe, the Critic Center, the Center for Security and Crisis Governance at the Royal Military College Saint-Jean in Canada, and the Peace Research Institute, PRIO, in Oslo. We will have a discussion today focusing on different regulatory perspectives and different challenges that the EU is confronted with in the field of artificial intelligence, drones, and other emerging technologies. We are at a moment where we have the combination of two very important developments that bring particular relevance to our discussion today. So on the one hand, we have rapid technological transformation in the field of AI and other technologies, and also the way that AI intersects with other technologies, with other forms of science, but also, on the other hand, increasing geopolitical instability. And so the confluence of these two developments bring additional challenges that we are here to discuss. So we are going to do this in an interactive way. We'll have short presentations by all of the speakers. We will have time for Q&A afterwards. And the way that we'll be doing this is that first we'll have a welcoming remarks by Dan Baer. Dan is a Senior Vice President for Policy Research and Director of the European Program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So he's based in Washington, D.C. His perspective is particularly relevant for the issues that we want to discuss today. So, Dan?
Great. Thanks very much, Bruno. And thank you to all of you for being here today. It's a pleasure to be with you. I want to pick up on some of the context that you alluded to in your introduction and kind of set the context for today's conversation. First of all, I'm delighted that there's so much really interesting work being done on emerging technologies here at Carnegie Europe. And that's happening in a broader context within Carnegie, but also obviously in the world that we're living in. And I think it's worth all of us, the world right now is one that inspires a lot of hand-wringing and cringing and concern for the way that old institutions are being put under strain, for the conflicts that we see not only in Ukraine and Gaza, but elsewhere. And I think it's important to not lose sight of the fact that that backdrop, climate change, et cetera, that backdrop, all of those things are unfolding against the backdrop of a truly transformational technological moment. And here I mean moment in the sense of several decades. I think we're kind of in phase 2. And I'm going to oversimplify here, but if the first phase of that technological moment was about communication and storage and organization of data, the second phase of this moment is about analytics. And AI and other emerging technologies, the emerging biotechnologies that we see today are part of that second phase. And, you know, the world has experienced technological transformations before that have reshaped political economy and geopolitics. But while this is similar in kind, it feels like it's much different in degree, and certainly for the speed and the global nature of this transformation. So that's part of the context that we're living through. On AI in particular, I think one of the things about new technologies is, of course, they are always replete with opportunity to make human lives better, and they also present new consequences or risks. And I think Carnegie is doing a bunch of work across geographies and applications on AI, and as we build that work program, of which Raluca's recent paper and today's conversation is part, we're trying to keep in mind a few things. First of all, one of the things that I remind people of is that we are very much, there's a lot of hype around AI, and there's a lot of very confident assertions about what it will mean for the world. And I think nobody actually knows yet. And one of the things that I often repeat is that we're still in the phase of identifying the right questions. We aren't in the phase of being able to confidently assert answers. And I think there's a bit of humility that is good for all of us to have in a moment like this. But Carnegie's president, Tino Cuellar, is in many ways leading our work on AI these days. And one of the things that he said recently in a meeting that resonated with me is that we should kind of stress test or use or check our work against three general principles. The first is that the implications of AI are global, and global both in the sense that they are likely to be globally significant, whatever they are, and we may not know exactly how it will play out, but we know enough to know that it will be globally significant, and that they are transnational, that they won't be managed by any one country, and therefore we need to keep in mind as we look for policy solutions that frame. The second is that our policy solutions, our attempts to govern AI, should be pragmatic. It's very easy to get lost in the kind of sci-fi-esque scenarios and the hypotheticals that could happen, or in the genuinely deeply philosophical questions that the artificial intelligence kind of moment raises about what it means to be a person and what it means to think. But our approach to governance has to be practical at the end of the day, and so we should look for pragmatic approaches. And the third is that AI should benefit everyone. Just as the consequences of AI, or just as AI is global in its impact, we should be attentive, and it isn't necessarily naturally occurring given our political economic structures, for the benefits of new technologies to benefit everyone. And one of the things that we should be attentive to now as we think about how we are going to govern this technology is how we can do so in a way that that benefits everyone, not just for the humanitarian concern that we rightly have that new technologies are actually making human lives better everywhere, but also because the extent to which we pay attention to that third principle will determine how legitimate the governance approaches that we take are seen in other parts of the world, in all parts of the world. The last point I want to make is about cooperation, and today's conversation focuses on the EU, and I think part of the pragmatic approach is recognizing that we can't manage all the risks and still harness all the benefits, and so there has to be pragmatism in weighing trade-offs. One of the things that I think will be most important in the next few years, and indeed in the coming months, is for the United States and the EU to really ramp up the degree to which they are able to not necessarily identically or simultaneously approach these policy questions in tandem, but certainly to coordinate and to share on how we are thinking about these policy questions. Because the United States and the EU need to be on the same page, at least, if there's going to be a chance for there to be effective global coordination on the governance challenges that AI presents. They need to be on the same page so that they can engage with other very important actors like India that are rising powers with strong technology, skills base, and private sector. They need to be coordinated because they need to think about which actors in geopolitics might use AI in ways that threaten global security and peace. And so I think one of the agenda items on both sides of the Atlantic has to be stronger coordination between the United States and the EU on this. And with that, I'm very much looking forward to the conversation, and I'm grateful to the panelists for being here, and I look forward to learning a lot, and congratulations again to Raluca on her recent work.
Thanks so much. This was really interesting and helpful to help us setting the scene for the discussion. I was particularly captivated with this idea that the technological challenges kind of seems similar in kind to other transformations that we had in the past, but different in terms of degree. This makes me think or connect with some of the work that you have been doing, Raluca. For several years, we've been working on how the EU, first your work looks at kind of to more classical security and defense questions, but you have been, over the years transitioning to kind of to a greater focus on technological issues. Just recently, and when I mean recently, I would say 2 days ago, you have published this very interesting report that I really recommend to everyone, charting the geopolitics and European governance of artificial intelligence. So kind of, in a way, it seems that has been a transition from questions that have been raised in different technologies coming up to contemporary debates on artificial intelligence. So how is the EU dealing with the governance of artificial intelligence in this, geopolitical context?
Thank you very much, Bruno, and thank you, Dan, for the introduction, and thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. I don't know if I have the right answer to your question, and thank you already for promoting the paper. You also might find some QR codes there to link directly to the Carnegie Europe website. So I want to pick up as well on some of the points that Dan already introduced, and also your question. I was on the train from Ghent to Brussels, and I was looking over a report actually published last year. This was a report put together by Microsoft in 2023, looking at how actually early stages of ChatGPT-4 are already exhibiting sparks of artificial general intelligence. Of course, this is quite a buzzword to speak about now. This is really interesting even for a non-scientific eye like myself. Disclaimer, I'm not at all an AI expert, a STEM expert for that matter, but already by reading that report, or at least paper, I was quite scared. If the sparks are already there and in early stages of ChatGPT-4, then the question, of course, is also one of humanity, and what does that mean as well for governance and policy action for that matter. I don't know, it doesn't feel that we are actually slowing down, but rather we are ramping up. I think that every month is actually an AI revolution nowadays, and keeping up with all the developments is quite a challenge. When it comes to the paper itself, and also what I want to present in terms of takeaways from the paper, I have 3 points. They are very short, I hope, and I hope we will have actually the conversation this afternoon to really dig a little bit more deeper. So as Bruno was saying, the paper that we published, it's called Charting the Geopolitics and European Governance of Artificial Intelligence. It's a project, Carnegie Europe project, published in the context of the McGovern AI grant. And it really looks at the multifaceted ways in which the European Union engages with the geopolitics, governance, regulatory initiatives, but also innovation of artificial intelligence. So it's really a timely report. So it's a long one as well, but I highly recommend you to read it, because it provides really a tour d'horizon of what's happening at the moment when it comes to the European governance of AI, but also it gives some recommendation on what the EU can do to engage more strategically on a foreign policy level when it comes to promoting its responsible, trustworthy, and human-centric approach to artificial intelligence. So the first point is already there. I presented the report. Please, I invite you to read it online, and feel free to reach out as well if you have further questions on it. When it comes to the report itself, the main focus of it is really to question how the EU can more strategically and more together, let's say, engage with promoting its value-added proposition, this idea of responsible artificial intelligence, especially when it comes to more the extraterritorial effects of all the initiatives that it is currently engaged in. Also in terms of the innovation angle, but more importantly, we well know regarding the Artificial Intelligence Act. This brings me actually to my second point related to the Artificial Intelligence Act, and why the title of the report is Geopolitics of Artificial Intelligence, and how the EU engages with more the geopolitical dynamics and the current global race to innovate in AI, but also to regulate when it comes to artificial intelligence. We have always considered, this extraterritorial effect of EU regulation, especially internal regulation. But I think that when it comes to the Artificial Intelligence Act, the stakes might be a little bit more higher, because of course the AI Act might have that extraterritorial effect in certain areas, but not in all of them. I say in the report that we are currently witnessing regulation race on the global stage, with governments pushing forward with their own regulatory regimes, but also we have different international governance initiatives, norms, all sorts of summits happening, and this is starting to become a really crowded landscape. So if the EU wants to be a first mover when it comes to also promoting its own internal regulatory approach towards artificial intelligence, there needs to be a more concerted effort when it comes to, bringing about a strategic and foreign policy coordination between EU institutions, but also across EU member states. And when it comes to the Artificial Intelligence Act itself, of course, the proof is in the pudding, I would say, because now the next stage is really in terms of the operationalizing the AI Act. Now, the third point of my presentation is related to the concerted effort from the EU, but as well as from other EU member states to really catch up on the innovation side. When it comes to the innovation race, of course, now the challenge is to really contend with major economies. We heard about the United States and China, but also big technological giants with budgets that rival states, for that matter, when it comes to the research and innovation of artificial intelligence. So when it comes to the report, I really delve deeper into what are out there in terms of EU initiatives to innovate, what the European Commission has been pushing forward as well when it comes to the innovation of such technologies. But of course, the biggest challenge is indeed to really finance across Europe a high-tech innovation ecosystem, because at the moment, the biggest challenge is, of course, that of creating champions, EU-based champions. Here, the race is still going on. The last final point related to the report as well. Actually, this is one of the first kind of chapters in the report where I also question some of the narratives and public perceptions related to the current geopolitics and arms race related to artificial intelligence. So here I think the challenge as well in terms of putting forward, governance initiatives, regulations, but also in terms of innovating is how we communicate with the broader publics and larger communities what the EU is doing, and also what the expectations surrounding the innovation of such technologies should be. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, we hear a lot about artificial general intelligence. Dan also mentioned, some of the challenges and risks of not really opening the black box of such technologies. We have heard a lot about superintelligence, existential risks and threats. And I think that the risk with these types of narratives, the hype surrounding artificial intelligence, is first of all, they shift public perceptions, maybe from more pressing issues. Second, there is this idea, of course, that such narratives also benefit some versus others. And also in terms of shaping the future, this is also very important in terms of governance, because they can also act as a smokescreen from more pressing challenges and risks related to governing artificial intelligence. Finally, when it comes to even the title of this report, the geopolitics angle, even saying that we are currently in an arms race, in a race to regulate, to innovate, this is again something that already shapes a specific perception of this technological domain. And this is indeed my last point. It's also it gives this impression, and maybe it pushes states but also companies to maybe undergo certain first mover approaches without taking into account maybe responsible regulatory safe ways to research and innovate such technologies. So it fits even more the arms race. So I think that this is my last cautionary point, and this is something that I also tackle in the conclusion of the paper. But thank you so much. I see the time's up, so I'm finishing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Raluca. This was really interesting. A lot of very relevant points, really worth discussing. I appreciate your focus on innovation and the challenges of innovation. And one of the areas that the EU has really been highlighting and putting resources behind when it comes to innovation in dual-use technologies is drones. And at the same time, it's interesting, so the title of this conference is From AI to Drones, etc. But in a sense, it could almost also be from drones to AI, because there are so many issues that have been debated, within the drone discussion over the years that are still pertinent today. And this is an excellent way to introduce Chantal Lavallee, assistant professor at Royal Military College Saint-Jean in Canada, also part of PRIO's regular project that has been working for many years on issues, on all sorts of governance issues surrounding drones. So Chantal, what would you say that is the EU approach to the governance of technology, particularly the case of drones, and what can we learn from that?
Thanks. Unfortunately, I don't have any report to present today to advise you to read, so I will do my best to be clear enough in the few minutes I have. Indeed, the aim with my presentation will be to give you kind of overview about the EU approach to drones. Who govern could be already a good question if we speak about governance. Is indeed the role of the European Commission to come with some proposals to govern, but what is interesting and is what I will present quickly in my presentation is the growing number of actors involved in the governance for different reasons with different interests, different tools. What I would like to highlight, if I need to catch your attention with one main idea, is that often we describe the EU as something which evolved just slowly and that nothing changed really with the time. But in the case of drones, we have seen different steps maybe, but a real shift in the way that the EU have approached the way to tackle the issue related to drones. And this shift can be summarized in passing from a really civil way of conceiving, describing the use of drones towards a really comprehensive approach to be more in line with what is drones, what are the technologies, and drones are dual use. And this was well known from the beginning. From the beginning of what, around 2009-10 was, the Commission was already interested by this technology, but started a series of consultations. And there were already the big debate about the use of military drones, all the debate about the extraterritoriality and all the issues. So there were kind of wheels from the European Commission to take a step back and say, let's focus really on the civil use. Also, it was in line with the Commission competencies back then. Still today, I don't have any scoop, but we will see this thing have changed, which explained also the shift of the approach of the Commission. So when started the discussion, it was, okay, let's tackle drones for what we think could be the future use. So the civil use of drones for many interesting things. We were speaking about the hypes about around the artificial intelligence, but back to 2010, if you remember, it was the beginning of, wow, let's buy a drones to documents our all our activities, so taking pictures and using also eventually drones for transportation. So it was the boom about the potential civil use of drones. So there the Commission framed the discussion around then how we regulate these tools as a new paradigm in aviation, because these drones, this technology will be integrated in the airspace, so and will challenge the manned aviation. So that was interesting by them to see how the Commission have really narrowed what drones are about, what is this potential, and all the regulation framework have been defined way to integrate drones and domains aviation, so to adapt the regulation and make it safe to integrate this new technology. And so that's, let's say, the first step. I have notes, I will not read them, it's just in 5 minutes to at least not forget anything. So that was the new things and this new paradigm, this new hype about the integration of drones. And also what is interesting, Raluca was speaking about the narrative, how it's important to look about the narrative for artificial intelligence, and the same for drones. It was, of course, the commercial boom, but then drones were perceived as a great opportunity for innovation, to create a new civil market for drones and to create jobs. So there were a lot of ambitions towards the economic potential. Also in the context that, of course, there were an increasing economic and technological competition already back then. And the idea was to create a drone market and to support the innovation in the sector. with funding. So it was about the market, about the research. But of course, regulation was the big elephant in the room. If you want the market possible, and we were discussing where you put regulation, then also it should not be put in opposition, but also you support your market and your innovation with clear rules. So that was also then the main objective. And the challenge was also how to balance supporting the development of the market, the innovation, and at the same time considering all the societal concern, which back then, 2010 to 2015, was about of course, the noise, the security aspect, I'm already there. Okay, so then was really the early stage, and the first strategy in 2014 was really regarding drones in terms of the integration in the airspace. So as an aviation, as a newcomer in the aviation. What is interesting, and I spent too much time on this first part, but what is the most interesting is what we have seen in the last year. So the shift happened with the drone strategy 2.0. So a nice way to brand this shift in 2022. With the strategy, we really take into account the evolution of the technology as such. We can say also how the Commission get more recognition and support to be involved also in defense sector and security, so to be more flexible and also to be involved in this area. And also we should not forget the impact of the war in Ukraine using more and more drones. So the idea that at some point we should also better consider the dual use of drones, and then the strategy better highlight this dual use, and the Commission start to enlarge also that the research, funding research for dual use purpose should be allowed, and to be more inclusive in the way to integrate the dual use dimension. And what is interesting is this was included in a broader discourse about the strategic autonomy to avoid technological dependency. So also all the overall discourse of the EU, so to embrace other EU objectives also. So the strategy was including the development of drones and the digital transition, urban mobility, but at the same time speaking about the strategic and geopolitical implications. And this was getting somehow more normal in the discourse. And what I want to highlight is that I spoke a lot about the European Commission, but we should think that the European Defense Agency was already looking about eventually our military drones can be integrated in this airspace. So to follow what the Commission was doing to allow this integration. So this comprehensive way was somehow getting how the EU should approach, and also in terms of speaking with the defense sector, but also including taking more into account, and I conclude on this, the security dimension. So we have seen in October the communication on how the EU member states, EU institution can also face the threat posed by drones. So with the counter-drone strategy to guide the member states and to better include also this dimension. And again, and I conclude on that, seeing all the risks posed by the use of drone already during the war in Ukraine, to see so many commercial and civil drones weaponized and used in the context of the war, and what kind of risk can be also considered in that perspective if that's happened with being misused in Europe for other purpose. So that was to give an overview, but I'm happy to go further in the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much. This was very, very interesting. You say that you don't have reports to promote, but you have a very interesting co-authored article commenting on the drone strategy that came out just a few months ago. Very good. And of course, you've highlighted very much the European Commission as a central actor in this sphere, and how the drones, in a sense, illustrate this transition from the European Commission that started by funding civil drones and then opening up for dual-use research, and then more recently through the European Defence Fund, more openly funding and directly funding military technology, and that applies to drones as well. There are several projects funded by the European Defence Fund, both on drones and Yeah, and counter drone technology, of course, and AI certainly. Of course, also there is the issue of dual use that you also brought to the table. That's very interesting. Jessica Dorsey, she's an assistant professor at Utrecht University. Jessica, for many years you have worked, as a lawyer from an international law perspective on issues surrounding drones in the battlefield. And more recently, you have kind of built up your research from that empirical material, opening up for the challenges that are brought by artificial intelligence. So what would you say, in terms of opening up for your presentation, what would be the implications of deregulating AI-based decision support systems for the future of warfare?
Yeah, thanks, Bruno, and thanks to the organizers. I think you said it earlier that basically this was called from AI to drones, but indeed I've done it the other way around. And I think the way that they're connected and why my research builds on that is that I've looked at the realities of how drones have changed the battle space and how the distancing of warfare from decision makers to a battlefield has now, basically, I call it in my research, doubling down on distancing, essentially adding another layer through AI and algorithmic applications to distance ourselves further from battlefield, from decision-making to battlefield, by farming out some of our decision-making to machines. And I think the decision support systems is a really interesting angle because oftentimes a lot of the attention and oxygen in the room has gone toward autonomous weapon systems, fully autonomous, lethal autonomous weapons. I won't use I will. It's the killer robots, of course, and we're all kind of in the eye-rolling stage of that. That is concerning, and right now, as we speak in Geneva, the group of governmental experts is hopefully making some progress in hashing out some more regulatory frameworks about that. We'll see at the end of the week how far we've gotten. But why decision support systems, they haven't gotten, in my view, enough attention, and what those are essentially, as their name sort of suggests, is tools and AI techniques to help commanders make decisions on the battlefield, and they do that through a number of different ways. Processing data, taking that drone footage that has been collected, intercepted communication and other ISR capabilities, processing it faster than humans are able to, and then recommending and sometimes nominating targets on a battlefield. This is a direction that states, militaries, and of course tech companies, I'll leave that to you, Marijn, are choosing to go. And it is a place that is full of that need for speed, scale, as well as regulatory challenges. So I'd like to touch on those three things in my few minutes here. The speed being an essential feature, helping to explain why these systems are on the rise. The aim, of course, on the battlefield is to outpace your opponent's ODA loop, so the observe, orient, decide, and act. You've got to do it faster than the other guy or gal or person in order to meet your strategic and operational goals. And this can be an important driver of such efficiency gain. So I understand that, intellectually follow that argument. In Gaza, to make it quite concrete, this has been reported that speed has played a prominent role in targeting Hamas leaders, and AI decision support systems have been reported to be used in developing targeting lists in order to effectuate strategic goals by the IDF. But the idea behind the speed element is that it's very difficult, even though these are systems that still have fully a human in the loop. That's very important because, again, the autonomous weapon systems are about when we let everything happen from and I think general agreement across the board, militaries and beyond, think that's a bad idea. But then the gray area is where we're talking about how far are we allowed to farm out these decision makings and how meaningful is our control as humans within a loop, a decision making, especially when these decisions are being generated or these recommendations are being generated at such a fast pace. And how this loops into legal issues is that the principle of precaution in attack mandates that everyone planning an attack must do everything feasible to verify that the targets that you are aiming at are indeed military in nature and not civilian. And if there's doubt, then the character of civilian is the overarching implementation. And related to that is the duty of constant care. So this is an obligation that is throughout the conduct of hostilities to spare civilians and civilian objects to the greatest extent possible. Okay, so speed, the generation of fast targeting, it's very difficult to know, and the scholar said it right, that it's becoming more constrained in terms of what kind of judgment that people can actually exercise. Even though the human is still in the loop, what kind of actual cognitive judgment are we able to exercise if we're moving so quickly? That leads into the scale issue. And to get really concrete, the reporting says that these systems that have been used in Gaza, instead of a previous method that the IDF was using that generated 50 targets per year, these AI-based systems are reported to generate 100 per day. So thinking about how quickly that targeting list is being populated and nominated, ostensibly the IDF claims that they are reviewing this within their own processes, and that is their obligation to do so. But it's very difficult to understand if you're scaling up that much, how that might not be able to comply with law. And that has to do with a lot of psychological limitations that we humans in the loop are confined to. The idea is that because there are more strikes, there's a cognitive action bias. More strikes yields more doing, right? And that's a phenomenon that we're aware of. Another bias, automation bias, can lead to over-trusting the system's recommendation. And finally, in high pressure, high stress situations, humans are more likely to defer to the judgment of machines. And that has been something that research has borne out. Other biases like gender biases, skin tone biases that other AI systems have been susceptible to also show up here in failures to recognize particular images, etc. All of this leads to a lack of transparency or explainability of these systems, leading further into a lack of accountability for life and death decisions. And this also feeds into the lack of legitimacy for military targeting operations. The last point before my time runs out is to talk about, okay, so what can we do about it? Not just talking about the problems, but what do we do about it, legally speaking? As most focus has been on the autonomous weapons discussion, that's great. We've already got something moving there. There are other fora that I think will lend themselves to diving deeper into these sort of gray are dual-use technologies, like, for example, at the United Nations General Assembly. There's space that might be carved out for that. There's another, the Re-AIM Forum that happened last February in The Hague and will happen again in September in South Korea to talk about hammering out things that fall short of that fully autonomous weapon system. And another thing that's sort of almost too good to be true is that IHL already allows for us to regulate this. We have Article 36 regulatory frameworks. These are obligations states are to undertake when they introduce a new weapon or means or method of warfare. Oftentimes it's just focused on the weapon, meaning dual use stuff is sort of not taken with it. But if we broaden our understanding, and this is where I think the EU can do a very big service to humanity by underscoring member states' obligations to carry out and to broaden that Article 36 review process, to be more transparent about it in how they're understanding the legal effects of new technologies. So that is a means and a methods of warfare, falls squarely within the ambit of Article 36, but I think we need to kind of go back to basics and even further to the object and purpose of the Geneva Conventions, which is to minimize the harm of war to uninvolved civilians. And by centering that within EU regulatory work, I think a lot can be gained there. So in concluding, to round it off, I think everyone should read Raluca's brilliant report. I think her point to the idea of regulation not hampering or hamstringing innovation, rather allowing it to flourish. We need to sort of underscore that point early and often. And to finally go out on the note by colleague Brianna Rosen, who says, if AI speeds up killing in warfare, it really is on decision makers to slow it down. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Jessica. A very interesting, very powerful message as well. And it's, in a sense, interesting to see how the discussion today is evolving from, more general, high-level regulatory issues into focusing specifically on the issue of drones, but mostly within a civilian or at best dual-use dimension. But then understanding how the technology has really brought something into the battlefield and how that opens up new sorts of questions. And that is, in a sense, part of what Marijn will also bring to the table. So Marijn Huiting is research professor at the University of Antwerp for several years as well. You've been doing really interesting work on different dimensions of security, from the role of private actors, what happens in security and technology fairs. All those things have been really interesting for us to understand how civilian technologies eventually make it to the battlefield. And we've seen new dynamics. So when we talk about the new moment of AI, it's also a moment where we see that a lot of technological innovation is happening in civilian settings and then is being, captured by the militaries and brought into military establishments. So we see that many of the cutting edge technologies, many of the state of the art when it comes to AI technologies is not in the militaries, is actually in the commercial, in the civilian sphere. So Marijn, how can we analyze and understand the acceleration of technological development and innovation in today's battlefield?
Thanks, Bruno, for inviting me and for basically taking away my talking points right here, right now.
Underscoring.
I will underscore them. And indeed, I'll talk a bit more about speed or acceleration of technological developments and innovation and how some of these new technologies, including AI, applications for the military are brought into the battlefield. So that acceleration, I think, is very clear, right? From developments that we're seeing in Ukraine, but also in Gaza, where both spaces, in fact, have been or are now commonly described as a laboratory or a lab for the experimentation, testing, and development of all sorts of newer technologies, such as smaller drones, FPV drones, AI decision-making tools and systems, satellite imagery and recognition of satellite imagery, and all sorts of other technologies. And of course, those operate also alongside more conventional ways of warfare, right? So that's also important to recognize and to emphasize. So returning to that particular question of acceleration, how we can analyze it and explain it, I would like to make two broader points, sort of broad brushed points. I'm happy to talk about it and nuance it further during the discussions. So first of all, I wanted to emphasize that those developments that we're seeing today in Ukraine and Gaza and other conflicts, by the way, do predate those wars and conflicts, right? And that many of these developments are part of a broader transformation, I would say, a broader development of how warfare is conducted. And I've described that 2 years ago in an article by referring to the concept of the experimental way of warfare. So with this term, I refer to the way in which war is increasingly underpinned by experimental activity, by sort of an urgency to experiment, a constant form of experimentation with new technologies, but also really on the battlefield. And so really in relation to those two technological developments and innovation. And while, of course, warfare has always been an experimental activity or has been defined by experimentation, I argue that what is particular about today's context is that it's really the scope and the scale in which experimentation spans across the military domain and also across an increasingly wide range of military practices. And at Raluca, I really liked your idea of the sort of pressure of the first mover narrative. I think it's an important way of explaining, indeed, the sort of the ways in which experimentation has really been pushed, has been accepted, and is really, explicitly acknowledged as an important practice by the military and on today's battlefields. So it's increasingly a way of doing warfare, of organizing our way of warfare, but war is also increasingly understood as an opportunity for experimentation. And I think we do see this very much also in today's discourse and narrative about the war in Ukraine, the role of Western militaries involved there that also see this kind of warfare as a context in which they can also experiment with their new technology or their new kinds of systems. So we see it in Ukraine, but also in relation, for instance, to Project Maven, which recently gained a lot of attention again, but which for many years now has served as a sort of pilot project, right, or an experimental project to make AI decision-making in the context of war possible. So in this article and in my broader work, I argue and try to emphasize that there's a risk, that there's many risks involved when it comes to this experimental way of warfare. So in a way, it's blurring the boundaries between war and peacetime, right? When war becomes an opportunity for experimentation, there's a risk involved, I think. And at the same time, I'm also concerned that our wars and conflicts in a way become endless and everywhere, not just because of our enemy or the potential of our enemy, but because of the need sort of continue or to keep on experimenting and to sort of to be that first mover that Raluca was talking about, to keep that experimental infrastructure in place, so to say. So that was my first point. A second point that I wanted to make here is that this acceleration and this experimentation is not just the outcome or the practice of the military. It's not just part of military innovation experimentation, but it's also increasingly, we could say, a private affair. And these are private actors with little or no ties to the military, right? So these are not our traditional military defense, industrial, complex actors, so to say. In fact, the private actors that are best at experimenting and innovating are those coming from the corporate sector, from the civil sector, from the new tech industry. And again, we see this very clearly in Ukraine, where SpaceX or Elon Musk's SpaceX is operating the Starlink infrastructural backbone for the Ukrainian military. But also, if we look at a company like Palantir, a data analytics company that self-proclaims to be doing most of the targeting nowadays in Ukraine and for the Ukrainian military. So we see in Gaza less reported, but also becoming increasingly involved. So we see these bigger tech companies that have become, in a way, that have already infrastructurally expanded, that are part of our everyday life. But there's also a range of military startups that specialize in AI, in big data analytics, in self-piloting drones or cybersecurity, right, that become involved in these complex spaces. And I think as Dan also mentioned, these developments require a different kind of analysis that in a way goes beyond pathological nationalism, right? Something that has defined, I think, a lot of the work that has been done on the defense industry, for instance. And that looks at the sort of the complex production, but also circulation of these technologies across geographies, but also across civil military domains. So that is something I think that we should definitely take into account. Also, when it comes to the question of, or particularly when it comes to the question of regulation. So this is the last point I want to talk about, is that in the context that I was just describing, this question of how to regulate these technologies, how to regulate these companies, becomes increasingly difficult as these companies operate outside of traditional nation-to-nation frameworks for regulation or control. So we see in this particular context in which the contract can be a direct, or contracting can sort of directly take place between the military startup coming from the US and the Israeli defense company without much influence from the US government, to give an example, this seems to shift state control away from states towards, or from the public sector towards the private sector. And it also limits transparency, it limits accountability and democratic control over those military technologies. So final point is that taken together, I think both the sort of experimental focus, this experimental engagement, but also the increasing shift when it comes to responsibility, accountability, and technological know-how from the public to the private sector, this requires, a focus on the actual practices of production of these systems, the actual focus on the realities of their use in battlefields, but also much more complex acknowledgement, I think, of the different people, the different streams of money, the different ideas, the different practices that are involved in the making and the acceleration of these technologies. And lastly, it requires that we think differently, perhaps, about regulation, something that I'll try to do in the years to come. But that, in any case, includes those private actors as part of the discussion, but in a way that still holds them democratically, or holds them to account and controls them through democratic means. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Really interesting how just putting the emphasis and centering the discussion also on private actors really opens up the challenges and the opportunities that exist in this discussion. So now we have some time for Q&A. We have a very qualified audience, so as usual in Carnegie events, so it's a great opportunity for us to move the discussion further. So please be welcome to ask questions specifically to some of the speakers or to the general panel. This event is being streamed, so we should be aware of that. And just to present yourself and make the question as short and as concrete as possible. Okay. Then, first mover.
Yeah, exactly. First movers and questions too. Dan Baer from Carnegie. Raluca, I wanted to ask you about what lessons you think the EU has learned from the GDPR in the context of AI regulation, because it strikes me that what an American cynic might think that what Europe is doing right now is, because it is relatively failing on the innovation front, it is turning to regulation as a way of doing something, which is actually counterproductive for Europe's future and not in the interest of America either, because we need a strong, innovative Europe. So I wonder what the lessons are and whether you think there's a covering for lack of innovation going with the enthusiasm for regulation. I just wanted two other comments. First of all, on Jessica, on the decision making, I think it's interesting to think about other contexts in which decision making is being automated and which we would also want humans in the loop, whether that is medicine, judicial processes where AI is likely to become more, and what is both different and similar in a battlefield context, because I think we're kind of learning about automated decision making in a bunch of different fields, and it's kind of cool to do a comparative study. You provoked me to think about some other things. And military experimental complex is like a really cool frame for the issues that you raised.
Raluca, do you want to
Sure.
answer? And then Jessica and maybe Marianne wants to say something about that as well.
Great question, by the way. Regulation versus innovation. Is this a true dichotomy or a false one? In the report, I argue it's a false dichotomy, actually. The twin ambition of the EU is both to create the so-called ecosystem of trust, which is the regulatory bit, and also an ecosystem of excellence, which is the innovation side. Of course, for that, it's really challenging at the moment. You need the financial tools for that to really spur, this high-tech ecosystem that I mentioned also in my brief presentation. I think that, of course, there are camps here and perspectives. Lessons learned from GDPR. More regulation would mean burdening, startups, SMEs, in terms of really adapting to this new regulatory regulatory framework, burdening. So kind of this bureaucratic, technocratic, of course, angle is very important to consider. There are other voices that say that, on the contrary, more certainty about the regulatory landscape will provide, startups, SMEs, and other players to really enter a market on certain terms. Namely this idea of trustworthy, responsible, value-based approach that the EU is promoting when it comes to AI, which is, again, AI systems can come from different angles with different risks, and the AI Act really aims to basically give more of a broad room of maneuvering to startups and SMEs that are at the lower risk level or no risk level. So in this regard, they will not be impacted by this regulatory framework. But when it comes to the high risks or the ones, the AI system models that should be banned, this is kind of the concern, of course, of the EU's AI Act. So I would say that this twin objective can be reached. And I think that the United States is also following. So in terms of the Brussels effect, I think that there is still a sort of a convergence. On the one side, in the EU, there is much more concern about national security concerns, about this idea of thinking more strategically about this domain. But on the other side of the Atlantic, I think there is also awareness about the need to govern and regulate this technological field.
It's a good question. It also inspires me to set one of my master's students in law and tech off on a field day to talk about that comparative study angle. I think for me, it's a point that Marijn, you mentioned that's really crucial here, is about risk and understanding how we understand risk. And in the military context, risk has life and death consequences, and that risk is very heavy and should not be taken lightly. So the idea is that we should be regulation heavy in situations, perhaps also conducive to the medical field, et cetera. It's different from the chat bot that we're customer servicing. Like, I guess it's okay, it's annoying, I'd rather talk to a human, but this might get me there faster, I get it. But when we start that sliding scale of risk, I think one point with my empirical knowledge of droning on and on for many years is to understand what remoteness does and what shifting decision making does. It doesn't eliminate the risk. It may, for a drone user, minimize the risk to forces or personnel, but it shifts the risk. It doesn't eliminate it, and that shift is borne by those under whom these drones are flying, these people on the ground. So I think understanding, automating that, farming out more, we have to understand the real risks in terms of what happens when these machines don't do what they're programmed to do. How can we find out what they did in order for that not to happen anymore? This black box idea, or the gray box, however others are discerning it. Like, if we don't understand it, how can we make our own actions on the battlefield better? So the first slowing down, I think, like, my first call is to resist that need for speed. It's a fabricated need in all sectors, I would argue. We can slow down, take a deep breath, understand this is really nuanced, complex stuff. We need to roll up our sleeves and do the hard work. But it is hard work, and it's going to take a lot of time to figure out where the lines are. But I think my last point is, if it's a life or death decision, that's something that a human needs to be fully in control of from the beginning all the way through to the end.
Yes, and even if the machine can make that decision better.
Yeah, but that's, yeah.
That's the moral insight, is that
I think so.
Even if the machine can be more discriminate,
Yeah.
I think we would still say that a human needs to make the decision.
And I think where that comes from, I mentioned in a recent documentary, is that only humans can account for killing other humans, period. For me, it's always been about transparency, how that plays into accountability, and to make it translatable also to military personnel. It's not just lawyers wanting to sue you or put you in court. It's also for your own operational legitimacy. So there's an interest across the board, I think, in making sure that these machines are doing things you want them to be doing in the long term, not just in short-term gains. Slow down. We need to slow down.
Marijn, do you want to add something, or?
I'm always looking for new titles for project proposals, so this is great.
Okay. So let me just also kind of open the remind the people who are following online that they can post questions on the YouTube chat, and then the questions will come to me. But I see some hands here. There, maybe first. Yeah. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sasha Simon from EYSS. I have a question, sort of connecting remote drones to autonomous ones. Something that I'm always searching for as a reason to be more optimistic and less pessimistic. So I think it's relatively clear that remote control drones are proliferating at an incredible speed right now. But I wonder, what is your opinion on how fast that sort of upgrade from remote to autonomous can be done? Because I always worry that it's essentially a software update. But of course, there's also a hardware component to it relating to semiconductors, which are now being very heavily controlled. So, like, what's your opinion on how can you delay the speed of that upgrade, and how effective is semiconductors as a sort of hook to approach that? Because I think the proliferation of remote control drones is gone. That ship has sailed. But how do we slow down autonomous systems proliferating on, like, sort of riding that wave?
Is this a question for any specific person, or does any of you want to start answering?
You can start as well, because you are next.
I'm not sure how much I can add to this. There's certainly difficulties in regulating this that come out of the dual use character of the technology. I think that this is really a crucial point. I think that there are some dual use export regimes that are in permanent revision, and I think that these debates that we're having here are also happening there. So I don't know the technical specifics that would make, for example, drone swarms something that could be within the realms of exports regimes and other types of regulation. I think that there's certainly problems that come out of the multiplicity of actors, and precisely as Marijn was saying, who do you bring to the table when you want to kind of to regulate, to limit? Who are the actors? Who are the stakeholders, right? And so we are still in a phase of trying to understand the bigger problem. I would say I don't have an answer about how specifically the issue should be tackled, but I'm not sure if I look at this problem as a way to try to feel a little bit more optimistic, because I think that, for example, in the case of fully autonomous drones, the technology has basically already arrived, and fully autonomous weapon systems that there are most likely have already been used in the battlefield fully autonomously. So in terms of the ship having sailed, I think that we are actually probably already there as well in that field specifically. So I'm sorry that the answer is not very concrete, but I think that the kind of very precise answer about how to deal with this is an answer that I don't have and that no one actually has. You too? Prohibits.
I think it goes back to, again, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but this is a new application of the Article 36 reviews. If you're talking about the use of new technologies as a means or method of warfare. And I think we have to be careful when we say, okay, well, cordoning off this idea that there's a new category, these autonomous systems, how do we stop them? It's a sliding scale of stuff that we've already got, right? I mean, the MQ-9 Reaper can be outfitted with, these names are just fantastic. Somebody should be doing a discourse analysis on this. But this idea of this surveillance technology, Gorgon Stare, and the Agile Condor, when you outfit these particular things, they're software upgrades. It's already happening. And so it's not just the US that's experimenting with this, but the Dutch are also experimenting with this. And we're trying to find out more information about exactly how. But with respect to regulation, I do think, I think we need to exhaust what already is there. And I think Article 36 has an application that's not yet been really tested, but I think this could offer a way that allows for member states of the EU and the EU to push behind the need for really centering the protection of civilians in warfare and the fundamental rights framework behind this.
Yeah, Raluca wanted to add, and then you, yeah?
It seems that this topic has stirred a lot of passion in the panel. To answer your question related to what I see at the moment, also to lessons learned from especially the Russian war in Ukraine, and also to your question about AI and drone nexus. So on the one side, what I see is an increasing innovation of this type of civilian low-cost types of drones. So Jessica mentioned, the big ones, the Reapers, the Predators, and so on. And there is an expert actually in the room that has been looking at, these drones being truly produced, as also Marain was mentioning, by the military-industrial complex, by the weapons manufacturers. But what we see now is this proliferation of civilian off-the-shelf, very low cost. So you don't need this really big budgets to make a difference. So of course, I always like to say that drones are like with Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. What's in the name that which we call a drone? By any other name would smell as sweet, meaning that drones can encompass a lot of technologies. Then what we see as well is this miniaturization. I think that this is super important as well, of how, for instance, on the battlefield, mass and kind of smaller technologies matter, as well as the capacity to produce them really, really fast with 3D printing, so talking about other technologies. And the final point is that of what also Bruno mentioned of swarming. I think that there is a lot of interest from the military side to pivot towards this. But of course, the question is, of course, how you introduce them in the typical systems, traditional systems, conventional systems, and how you make use of them as well in terms of offensive and defensive purposes. But I think that these are trends that we can already observe for some time now.
Yeah, maybe very quickly, I think one of the things that I have seen in the context of actually our research on the Dutch case is something that is interesting, is that there's a lot of work actually in sort of translating translating algorithms, models from off the shelf to the military, and that, for instance, the Dutch army is actually quite concerned or interested in doing that well, sort of translating that carefully. So I did also see Maaike Verbrugge in the room, who has written about this, right? That it's not so easy to do that translation from the civil to the military domain. My worry, though, is that, okay, that's true, but that at the same time, the ship has sailed, right? The train has left the station, and that means that we get sort of sloppy models, sloppy AI, to be integrated on the battlefield. And that in the sort of rush for speed, that we get sort of the worst of both worlds.
Thanks so much. We have more questions in the room, but we also have a question online that I would like to bring to the table. And this is for everyone here in the panel, but also for you, Dan, because it relates very much to some of the points in your talk, and the question is, what strategies can the EU employ to foster cooperation and alignment with other global actors in setting international norms for emerging technologies? So this is a question about cooperation, between the EU and other partners when it comes to the norms and when it comes to the rules. But what could be the strategies for cooperation at the moment where we start to see a growing potential for transatlantic divide on strategic issues, on issues and security and defense? Does someone want to try to say something about this?
I don't know if this isn't a strategy, but it's an opportunity. First of all, I mean, just as a general point, and I made this point in an internal meeting this morning, I increasingly hear from Europeans that they are in some way pressing pause on kind of collaborating with the US on a variety of policy issues until they know the outcome of the 2024 election. And while I understand the impulse behind that, it's exactly the wrong thing to do. First of all, even if you think the odds are 50-50, there's a 50% chance that you have another administration that is looking to cooperate with Europe, and wasting a year of cooperation this year would be a shame if you're actually going to be ready to cooperate again this time next year. And if that's not the case, and we don't know what a second Trump administration would be, if that's not the case, then it's really important to actually lock in as many affirmative, cooperative goals that serve both sides of the Atlantic while you can. And so, to my mind, the right impulse, regardless of what happens in the U.S. 2024 election, is to do more cooperation now. In that context, I think bringing some of these issues increasingly into the Trade and Technology Council is an obvious step. The other near-term opportunity might build on the release by von der Leyen of the EU defense industrial policy strategy this week, which, if Europe can figure out how to agree on how to fund that, which is a big if, will create new industrial incentives that can be the platform for a real conference of equals, particularly the defense sector, on how these technologies get integrated into new weapon systems, which will inevitably include also how they are built into defense strategy and military posture, et cetera, both at NATO and also could be on a EU-US basis to some extent. And so I think those are two near-term opportunities for a joint approach on some of these issues, in addition to many others where the EU and the US cooperate on tech and tech regulation.
You wanted to add something, or just holding? Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, no, I would have said the same thing in terms of the TTC as well. I think that this was a very important forum to discuss, especially at the executive level. And the question, of course, of its survival is still up in the air. But I think that the starting points there in terms of discussing about technological standards, not only AI, other technological domains. We heard about semiconductors. I think that's super important as well when it comes to artificial intelligence. Getting on the same page when it comes to the trustworthy approach is again highly important. So when it comes to these bigger ideas, values, and norms, I think there is a lot of agreement across the spectrum. Of course, there are some, let's call them spoilers potentially, but they are not necessarily spoilers. I would say there are more disagreements, but these at the higher principle level are still shared across the Atlantic. And I think that we have seen as well with other summits and meetings and international organizations and codes of conduct already published out there, that agreement is shared, at least at the principled level. Of course, again, the devil is in the details, but on the longer term, I think that is a very strong starting point, because without going at it with partners, Europe will not achieve, even this first mover approach when it comes to trustworthy AI or governing AI. So these strategic partnerships are highly important. And the US is one of them, but of course, other partners are highlighted always, for instance, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and so on.
Yes, very good. More questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Thank you. This may be a little provocative, for which I apologize. My name is Anthony Gavel. I'm a policy assistant at DG NIR. And I wanted to come back to what Professor Dorsey said about autonomous weapons, going away from the hardware and sort of back to the values of it. And I agree completely that our sort of Western belief in the inherent value of human life is a very good argument against accelerating the development of autonomous weapons and so on. But we do know that not everyone around the globe shares that belief, and we do have actors who do not value human life as much as we do, which we see on Ukrainian battlefields, for example. So how do we ensure that without compromising our ideals, we don't find ourselves in some hypothetical situation trying to play a game of chess against Deep Blue, like Kasparov did, and losing like he did?
€1 million question. Look, I think just to zoom out a bit, I mean, we have a rules-based order, generally speaking. And some interpret it in different ways. That is a given. But I think if we are serious in the EU or in Western countries or in a cooperative partnership with transatlantic considerations, like we need to understand why we need to go back to why that rules-based order exists, where it came from, the last 75 plus years, the existence of rules in warfare. And I do think that that needs to be part of the discussions. Are we still committed to that? Do we still believe that this rules-based order has a place? I argue that it underpins the entire body of humanitarian law. Whether or not your enemy complies with the same rules-based order is beyond the scope of whether you're obliged to do so or not. So in that sense, I think the argument is, well, if they won't follow the rules, why should we? Is a really dangerous path I would very heartily recommend against going down. I understand, the whole idea behind the hype, understand the speculative nature that Dan mentioned in his opening, what AI is going to do. I think we need to focus on what AI is doing now with humans in it. And as you mentioned, sometimes we're getting the worst of both worlds, even though it promises more precision, more accuracy, etc. What kind of wars are we wanting to fight? Those are questions that belong in the discussions we need to be having to slow things down and really get to the essence of what that means to be human, to fight wars. It is inherently a human endeavor. Are we okay with farming out a lot of it to machines, and what does that mean? What are the consequences in the short, medium, and long term? So I don't know that I have a really solid answer other than, again, to abandon the rules-based order, as imperfect as it is, and as gray and open to interpretation and differences in meanings, but of course also transatlantically. We don't always agree on how these rules should be interpreted. But I think that that's a really dangerous path to walk.
Do you want to follow up on this one? Yeah.
For me, the moral argument, which is what the rules-based order essentially comes down to, is compelling, as I assume it is for you. And I take your question to be at the heart, like, by taking some of these tools off the table, are we going to be in a position where, let's just say it, China could win a military conflict because we don't avail ourselves of these weapons? I don't know how this will play out, but in the past, we have taken certain weapons off the table. Certain military practices off the table. And the way we've won geopolitical contests has not actually usually been through military means, but actually through the other means. And so I guess, let me put it this way. We can think about the future of regulating AI as something akin to nuclear weapons and nuclear technology, or as something more like the internet or something like that, something that's just much more integrated. And I guess how you see that playing out probably changes how you play out also the question on the battlefield. And one of the things that I think, and this goes to the creating an environment of trust, but I think one of the things that we should be thinking about is the moral power of getting enough states on board to say that certain kinds of uses, including in the military context, are illegitimate, are too dangerous, that will actually weaken the utility of those, in the same way that nuclear weapons are considered taboo. Even if we're in more nuclear risk right now than we have been in my lifetime, there's still not as strong of a taboo as there was 20 years ago, but there's still a taboo on the idea of using them. And certainly there's an understanding in Moscow that if Putin were to use them, even tactical nukes, that it would change the world's position on Russia. I think that he might feel like that would be the thing that would make us finally take the $300 billion, for example. So I think we can still have power, even if they are not playing by the rules. We can still have power in asserting a law-based regulatory approach to the battlefield. And I think we should also remember that seizing the opportunities that this technology presents and winning that affirmative race is actually the way that geopolitically we're likely to succeed in the long run.
Thanks. Chemical and biological weapons, a little less deterrent related, but the idea is that those are banned and generally frowned upon. I mean, we are successful in these efforts. landmines, yeah, except US. I think.
Okay, so thanks so much. We are running out of time. I see 3 hands here in the audience, and I have one question online. I think what I'll do the following. I will collect these different questions. Please be as quick as short as possible, and then the people in the panel choose the question that you want to answer. So I have a question here, another one there behind you that was first, and then you, and then the question online.
Thank you very much, Simona Suade with Lancaster University. Thank you very much to the panel for a very thought-provoking conversation this evening. I apologize for my voice. It's very croaky, I promise you. It doesn't get any better than this right now. I'm wondering, in line of what has been discussed so far with drone technologies, AI-enabled drone technologies proliferating rapidly, on and off the battlefield, what this means for the proliferation potential of counter-drone, counter-classification capabilities out there. And we are seeing these increasingly being tested and experimented with, particularly by China, Russia, Iran. The potential to transfer to non-state is very, very high. They're incredibly cheap and non-sophisticated. So what does this mean? Is this a catch-22 for us, again, by our adversaries, where we're thinking we're beating them with high-speed production of low-cost, attritable capabilities, and we're actually ending up on the other side where they can strap tires to their airplanes and they're fooling our classification algorithms very easily? By the way, that's super cheap. They didn't spend any money on that. Thank you very much.
Yes, then one question there, please. Yeah.
Thank you. Emma Gonzalez-Poor from the Global Policy Research Group. I have a question for you, Jessica, actually, and it's, you mentioned about the Article 36, and you said to broaden our perspective or understanding, and I would like to know what you mean by that, because the Article 36 reviews have been quite not publicly available. We don't really know what's going on. And if we take into account the fact that artificial intelligence and any autonomous weapon system it relates on the data that is inputted in the system, the algorithms might change. So how can we deal with the fact that there are all these changes that go along with the system itself, and we have to conduct a weapons review now and even during the course of the weapon, but how do you see this broaden understanding and maybe even the cooperation between states?
Good. Was there a question there in the back? Do you still have a question, or? Okay, good. And then, then I'll ask the question online. How do you think the larger role of the private sector in the world, given the ongoing multipolarity, will affect the efficacy of these traditional environments? So now I will suggest I'll give the microphone to every speaker up to 1 minute for a short answer. Then we will end to make sure that we end on time, but we'll have an informal reception afterwards where the discussions can continue.
Okay, picking and choosing the questions, maybe I will address Simona's question related to counter drones. Of course, as the technologies proliferate, also the counter technologies for that matter, and also their democratization. I think that you introduced another angle to this conversation with this non-state actors, access to such technologies, but also the cheapness, for instance, of electronic warfare, in jamming, in how some of the biggest, let's say, countries that are at the forefront of some of these technologies are involved here, but also, having access to open source. I think that's also something super important to consider. Then maybe just to add on this, in terms of drone and counter drone or AI or counter malicious AI types of approaches, I think the question is as well of who to outsource it to. Who are the experts here? Who are the technology experts? Who are the programmers? The ones that are actually at the forefront here. And I showed a video to my students in Vienna, actually from a sort of a very covert group in Ukraine of all these volunteers that are doing actually the forefront and actually lending their services and tech services in this regard, both in terms of counter drone efforts, but also in terms of really innovating when it comes to these technologies. Chantal.
Yes, quickly, but it's also on that point I wanted to react. What is interesting again in the EU approach is what we see the presentation of the last communication on counter drones measure is at the difference of the previous initiative in the EU looking into the regulatory framework and to give legal references. With counter drone is more to share good practices, to involve civils, military actors, to see also to create a living lab and to test in real time what this means, how it goes, to develop also a market of technologies to avoid the critical dependency or technological dependencies of the EU toward this new technology, but to develop them and to involve the different actors. So I think this is how the EU somehow approach this, and involving the different actors. Also, the interesting point I found that thinking that the military will probably use some kind of technology than the civilian and a different purpose, but then to mix the expertise to reach the goal at the end.
Thanks. So I'll focus certainly on, that's a great question, because states have been very opaque about how they do these things. Of course, this is the point. I think EU can play a role in pushing member states to be more upfront. Other allied coalition forces, they can make that sort of prerequisite when entering into agreements with other states or other operational agreements, that they need to be more transparent about these practices. I think CIPRI has a great report about Article 36 reviews and autonomous systems, fantastic. And then also Claudia Klanowska has a brilliant article, and I'm just going to quote from that, because I think also just to remind the room that Article 36 reviews spell it out for us. In the study, development, acquisition, or adoption of a new weapon, all stages, from the beginning all the way through its use, in a weapon, means, or method of warfare, high contracting party is under an obligation to determine whether the employment would be prohibited by the Geneva Conventions. Okay, so it's very simple to go back to those basics. Claudia outlines ways in which this can translate with respect to autonomous systems and decision support systems specifically. 4 criteria, she says, any technology that poses a challenge to the application of IHL should come under this review. So this is broadening that umbrella. It's not really broadening it. I think it's giving some, perhaps, some meat on the bones. I hate that analogy, sorry. If it's integral to military decision-making, it needs to be reviewed. If it significantly impacts on military operations and it contributes to critical offensive capabilities. There's a checklist that we could spell out and understand how that looks, and with more transparent practices, shared practices amongst allies, we can understand better how that can be employed and used when we start translating dual-use technologies onto the battlefield and vice versa. So I hope that was okay. Thanks.
Bruna, I'll speak to the last question, but I didn't understand the last part of the question.
How do you think of the larger role of the private sector in the world, given the ongoing multipolarity, and how it will affect the efficacy of these traditional environments? And by traditional environments, I assume that it's regulatory environments, the setups where decisions are made.
Okay, and private sector, of course, also relates to, could relate to a larger domain, but I'll speak to maybe the industry that's mostly connected to AI, right? In a broad sense, and there I think that the current global order is multipolar, but it's also increasingly digital, and it's increasingly shared also with large digital actors, and there's a really large body of literature and media studies that has described this and explained this, and has shown how these types of private actors with lots of sort of power concentrated in their hands are able to transform many of our daily domains, right? Education, health, finance, if we talk about automated decision making in some of these domains. For the military, that's still somewhat different, I think, and it is something that we will see playing out in the coming years. I think the role of Microsoft in sort of prior to the war in Ukraine or the Russian intervention of Ukraine is very interesting to follow. Also the sort of geopolitical role that they tend to play, and I think Raluca organized a really interesting panel a few months ago here at Carnegie in December, where the public affairs person of Microsoft was mentioning that they have a lot of power. They have significant power also vis-a-vis states, but she was saying that she expects this to be less in the coming years. My expectation is that they will probably be able to increase their power, authority, and involvement also based on, or on the basis also of the hype that's connected to AI. And their consolidation and their platformization and their infrastructuralization. I mean, there's a lot of these different practices involved, yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. We've reached the end of our event today. I'd like to thank everyone in the audience, the participants. This has been very interesting. And on behalf of the Peace Research Institute Oslo, I'd like to thank Carnegie and the Critic Institute. This has been a very fruitful discussion. And now I would like to invite everyone to continue informally to discuss over a reception that we'll have here just on the side. Thanks very much.